So, wow, five very, very interesting papers with different perspectives on this period of Australian history and Australian policy. So we'd like to keep this conversation, as I said, focused on the issue of the Whitlam government, international law, human rights, with a focus on what we can learn from that point in history for how Australia engages with the world going forward. Beyond that, the floor is completely open to any kind of respectful questions or comments. So who would like to get the ball rolling? I think we should start with people at the other end of this table.
Michael Leach from Swinburne University of Technology. I'm a Timor-Leste scholar and I run the Timor-Leste Studies Association. I co-founded it and we run conferences in Dili every couple of years, and it's now an area studies association. I'm not an expert on Australian foreign policy, though I'm certainly familiar with Australian foreign policy in relation to East Timor. So I sort of wanted to make a couple of comments, and I was asked to come, and I was very grateful to do so. It's been a fascinating day. From the Timorese perspective, I sort of don't want to go into what's already been covered by the speakers in a much better way than I would around the Australian foreign policy machinations, but rather just if you can give me a couple of minutes to talk about the experience from the Timorese perspective might be useful. And I'm perfectly happy to accept, by the way, that this case can be seen as an exception to the sort of foreign policy that was prosecuted in the Whitlam years. Look, it's an interesting period in time. So what happens in East Timorese nationalism is a quite important volte-face, and I think this is sort of reflected in the Australian government has to volte-face as well. So up to 1974, you've got a very typical anti-colonialism. You've got an anti-Portuguese colonial movement. A lot of Timorese students by this point are in Lisbon in tertiary education, and they have a lot of relationships with Lusophone Africa, which is going through the same struggles. And of course, you've got the third wave of democratisation that definitionally hits Lusophone countries in Africa, Portuguese-speaking countries in Africa, and they're very part of that intellectual movement. And those students, who are of course a minority, Portuguese Timor, come back in various times in 1975 to their colleagues there in Dili, which includes people like Ramos Horta that we know, and Alcatiri, who were not in Lisbon. And they have, their heads are full of anti-colonial rhetoric. And I believe this is the sort of anti-Portuguese, anti-colonial, anti-European colonial rhetoric that Gough Whitlam would have been very comfortable with and very supportive of. But when they come back, they are faced with a different reality. And their colleagues back in Dili are saying, look, the much bigger problem is going to be Indonesian neocolonialism. And we need to actually start re-articulating into East Timorese nationalism. So they have to volte-face. This is a very difficult process. And so in that process, what happens is that East Timorese nationalism starts being articulated in a different way, and they start looking at the 500-year Portuguese history as something that has constituted a different political community, a different one from Dutch colonised West Timor and now independent Indonesian West Timor. So there's this internal thing that happens inside East Timorese nationalism. They have to volte-face, they have to accommodate a new reality, and in that process they start embracing things that made them different from West Timor over that period of time, because they were otherwise cognate Timorese societies before the colonial era. Now Australian foreign policy has to make the same adjustment, and my sense is that that was a difficult adjustment to make. I've seen a photo of Gough Whitlam in 1944 in Marialki. He was stationed in Dutch New Guinea. I wonder how many people are aware that that's where one of our greatest prime ministers spent World War II. I think it's an instructive image, and when I saw it, I was very struck, because I think that there was a unwillingness, and maybe James, you made this point about post-colonialism, an unwillingness to embrace the idea that Asians could be colonialists as well, and which is a curious position to my mind for someone who'd fought in World War II against the Japanese to hold. But nonetheless, I think there was a kind of stereotypical view of colonialism as kind of blue water European, that there was some conceptual difficulty volte-facing on that point. And of course, all the other realpolitik considerations. Back to Inside East Timor, just to reflect on some, and I am reflecting on the papers. Don't forget that there was a Whitlam UDT coalition in Timor in 1975. It was a very difficult construction. They had very difficult political perspectives. But this coalition existed, and it was a very powerful coalition because Apadete, the small party advocating integration with East Timor, had very little support. And so the combination of Whitlam, which wanted immediate independence, and UDT, which wanted a process of independence from Portugal to go over 4 or 5 years to 1978, had formed a coalition, and it was the Indonesians that destroyed that coalition. So that coalition breaks down from March 75 and results ultimately in the Civil War of August. And that civil war occurs shortly after key figures in the UDT return from Jakarta, where they were made aware in no uncertain terms that if Whitlam was part of this new order, that Indonesia would view very unfavourably the new independent state, and that they, to save the nationalist aspirations, as it were, of East Timor, need to move against Whitlam. So these were the product of Indonesian interference at that time. What I can certainly tell you is that in October 1975, the East Timorese, when 5 Australian employed, they weren't all Australians, but Australian employed journalists disappeared, and there was effectively no action taken. The Timorese at that point realised they were on their own. That was it. No one was coming. So at that point, they sort of gave up on Australia. They realised that they could expect nothing in the way of international recognition at that point. Now, the Portuguese were a post-revolutionary society from April 1974. Things were extremely chaotic. And it's certainly true that the Portuguese decolonisation process was a chaotic one, and Timor was a low priority in that, far away. However, there were local elections held in 1975 by the Portuguese in Portuguese Timor. Those elections took place, local government elections took place. This was incredibly threatening to the Indonesian New Order, the idea of village-level democracy in its region taking place, and a new society emerging where there was village-level democracy was certainly something that had been stamped out in the 60s in Indonesia itself. And this was an incredible threat to that order. And the final point I wish to make by way of context, East Timorese, even in that era, were aware in a way that Australians were not of the fragile nature of the eastern archipelago of the Indonesian state. Portuguese Timor had hosted refugees from the Pemesta Rebellion, which was an Eastern Islands uprising. They had got involved in an anti-Portuguese uprising in Vukake in 1959. They also had family connections with West Timor. And even today, though it's sort of thing you can't talk about, there are whisperings that if there was ever a major geopolitical crisis in the region, that the Eastern Archipelago could still cut loose of Indonesia. That sort of whispering under the surface, because it's very strictly punished, has never really gone away. So the East Timorese were aware that there was a kind of fragile nature to Javanese colonialism in that region. And I think the final point that I wish to make here is that all throughout the 24 years of the occupation by Indonesia, the Timorese very clearly pushed an agenda of self-determination. That was the language that they used the entire time. And they used things like the affinity to Portugal was used strategically, because it was to reinforce that claim in international law that Portuguese remained under international law the governing power until such time as there was a valid act of self-determination. And of course, by 1982 or so, or 81, the Portuguese had recovered sufficiently from their own turmoil to start prosecuting that agenda. And of course, the Timorese always had the support of the Lusophone African countries, Mozambique, Angola, through that entire period. And it's under Kofi Annan that agenda is really pushed, and that Portugal starts more actively asserting its continuing right, only in the sense of international law, to conduct a valid act of self-determination in that territory, until that they remained the nominal, power, administering power until that time. So that rhetoric of self-determination was certainly present in East Timorese nationalism through that entire period of time. And I hope that's been a useful comment in some ways. I just wanted to give something from the East Timorese perspective. I think it would be better if there was an East Timorese scholar here doing that, but since there isn't, I'm happy to put that forward, and I hope that provides some context to the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a wonderful contribution.
Hi, look, my name's Peter Jobe. I'm presently completing the last stages of a PhD at the University of New South Wales in Canberra on the Fraser government's policies towards the occupation of East Timor. But of course, I've had to look at Whitlam in depth sometimes to give you some idea of my background and why I've chosen that. Many years ago, I spent some months in the bush outside of Darwin helping to maintain the Fretlin radio link with some activists there, which Fraser was at that stage starting to come down. I was a secondary schools teacher for many years. Now, since being financially stable, I decided to go back to school and do what I've always wanted to do and study this area in depth. So you could say I have a certain bias there. I also have a bias the other way because without Whitlam, I never would have gone through university. I came from difficult family circumstances and I remain grateful for that. However, I'd like to, perhaps I could, some of my researchers, I've interviewed many departmental officers who were involved during that period, and I've gone through tens of thousands of documents, including 1975, before Fraser took power. The extent policy was made not where Whitlam's policy was firmed up not at his two meetings with Suharto, but when he sent his personal private secretary to go and speak with Harry Chan in Indonesia. Now, we don't have a transcript of that meeting, but it is clear that Whitlam conveyed his position that East Timor should be integrated into Indonesia then, because the very next week, in fact less than a week later, Harry Chan approached the Australian embassy and informed them of his policy, and it was a faction within the Suharto regime. There's a lot of evidence that, in fact, the Suharto regime was split on the issue and that the Indonesian Foreign Ministry took a different position. But they commenced a series of consultations, first of all during one Indonesian operation, Operation Komodo, during which that was a program to destabilise the colonisation process. After Fretlin came to power, it was a covert military intervention. We talk about the invasion of East Timor starting on the 7th of December. It's arguable, of course, you could backdate that to late September, which is when Indonesian troops first entered East Timor under the pretense of being UDT troops. But in fact, we all knew, and we knew this from direct consultations, that those troops were Indonesians in nature, with only a very small presence of some UDT and Apadeti troops. I've also found a number of documentations showing how split the regime actually was on this issue. Malik, of course, many of you would know, gave a letter to Jose Ramos Horta in late 1974 committing Indonesia to support a proper decolonisation process, including the possibility of independence for East Timor. However, that was not supported by a different faction. There was the Opsis faction. The Australians took the decision, and it was a decision very much taken by Whitlam, to convey their communications with Suharto through the Opsis factions, through the hardliners, through the war party, you could tell. I came across one documentation which was a dinner party involving Ambassador Furlonger in late 1974, in which there was some discussion in which Malik said that he thought he could accept an independent East Timor and that his ministry would be prepared to get behind that. Now, Furlonger, instead of welcoming this as a indication of the Indonesian Foreign Ministry being prepared to accept a proper decolonisation protest, described Malik as being a bit of a maverick on this and not to be taken seriously, and he probably had a political agenda because Furlonger by then himself was already committed very much to the same position that Whitlam took. And Whitlam was not Robinson Crusoe on that. There was elements in the department, but there were also elements in the department who pushed the other way, and I've interviewed several of them recently. Ross Cotterill, Geoffrey Miller produced papers during the federal administrations arguing for an acceptance of a Whitlam-led East Timor and attempting to persuade the Indonesians to do it, to accept it too. They both told me that when they tried to discuss that and when they tried to get it through, they were sat on, that Woolcott in particular refused to let those discussions go forward or for the idea to be discussed, but they attributed Woolcott's ability to do that because of the overawing strength of Whitlam's position. I owe a lot to Whitlam because I wouldn't be sitting here without it in a way, but having gone through tens of thousands of documents, I'm completely convinced that if Whitlam had taken an approach of normal diplomacy, nothing out of the ordinary, just expressing normal concerns and not accepting a proper decolonisation process, there never would have been an Operation Komodo or Flamboyant or a full-on invasion.
Peter, I'll move to another question now, but I might respond to that with some of the things I've been thinking about on this topic as well. This seminar is supposed to be about Whitlam international law, human rights. We're focusing a lot on East Timor, and that's fine, but I'd like to bring it back to the broader legacy and implications too. I don't know how many of you have read Graham Freudenberg's book, but his chapter on East Timor is very interesting. I certainly I learnt a lot myself about the competing challenges and the political context of that time, both domestically and internationally, in terms of what was happening. But one of the things that Graham Freudenberg points out that I think could be something we think about in terms of policy recommendations going forward was in relation to the fact that Australia no longer had a consulate in Dili at this time, and the closure of that consulate before the Whitlam government, but the failure to reopen it may have had some impact on the kind of balance of intelligence or information that was coming to the Australian government. Now, politically, maybe that would never have made the light of day, but we can certainly say that that perspective wasn't coming out of Dili at the time. I've seen the same thing in terms of diplomatic bias in other parts of the world where embassies are only in one part of a country where there's a conflict, for example, in Yugoslavia and Kosovo. The bias that comes through to governments can be very distinct. So I'm wondering if any of the panellists or anyone else around the table has any thoughts about this and what it might mean for Australia's continuing reduction in diplomatic presence around the world in different parts, where there's conflict or not.
Jim Dunn was certainly making a lot of noises around Canberra around 1974-75, and it is true that there was no longer a consular presence in Dili, but he had been there through the 60s and was a very strong opponent of the policy directions that were emerging at that time. So there was, and the Dunn report became something that was discussed in Parliament, and he was very, very active. So that perspective was not missing. And of course, he was a senior diplomat and former diplomat and quite a respected figure, but he became a controversial one in that time. So I guess I just want to, I think it's a good point, but it wasn't like that perspective was missing. So the veteran of Dili was certainly an active spokesperson at that time.
There was a lot of pressure from the Portuguese. That's one thing they all agreed on. UDT, Fretilin and the Portuguese government all wanted Australia to reopen a consulate. Whitlam strongly opposed it because he believed in non-involvement. But of course his position wasn't non-involvement. It was taking one side of the conflict. So,
who else would like to make a comment or ask a question of the panel?
Nina Burridge from the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, UTS, ex-history teacher as well, in actual fact, who probably wouldn't have gone to university without Whitlam again, back in the early 70s. I'd like to broaden the discussion, and I'm not an expert in this area at all. I'm more of an educator and looking at human rights education. Can you perhaps discuss the changing mindset? And we were chatting about this in relation to the progressivism of the 1970s with Whitlam in terms of human rights, in terms of Indigenous rights, and the contrast, and in terms of immigration as well, and the contrast to what we have post John Howard, or through John Howard's period and post John Howard. What has brought this about? What is the particular outlook that Australia has, both locally and internationally, that's changed?
very broad and very good question. Who on the panel would like to take that on to start with?
Well,
Do you know?
I can have a go. It's a tough question. I mean, one of the things that happened across a range of policy domains, I think, in the 1980s and 90s was a very, I think, deliberate distancing by the Labor Party of itself from the Whitlam heritage. I forgot to look this up before our seminar today, but I do have a vague recollection, I hope I'm not misquoting, of Paul Keating describing the Whitlam government as amateur hour on one occasion. This was very, I think it's right, isn't it? And this is very much a part, I think, of the self-image of, you know, those Labor governments over that 13 years, and indeed extended to some extent to the state government in that period as well. And I think that, you know, and this is a personal view perhaps as much as a piece of political analysis, but there was a lot of denialism, I think, during that period about just how much those governments were indebted to some of the broad patterns of policy, to some of the electoral strategies that really were thoroughly Whitlamite. When I look at, you know, for instance, some of the key state governments of that period, you look at Rann, you look at Kane in Victoria and so on. I mean, that combination of I guess social and social reform, I suppose you'd put a progressive social reform, with you know, various forms of economic modernisation. And you get it with the Hawke and Keating governments too. And I think that was much more indebted to the Whitlam period than any of those governments really cared to acknowledge during that period. And that's got a lot to do with collective memory, I think, of the Whitlam government, which was at a very low ebb during those years, I think, in a lot of ways. So I think it's had a lot to do with quite deliberate political strategies, I think, pursued on the centre-left. It's not the only, I'm sure there are other explanations and reasons as well, but I think that's certainly one of them, I think, anyway.
Can I answer that? Oh, sorry. No. I was just going to add. I agree, but I also see, like, for example, like what Frank was saying, like for ANZUS, with the Hawke government, you know, this concept that they had to fix this perception problem around the US alliance and ANZUS, and so that becomes this kind of distancing itself from the idea that somehow, well, Whitlam damaged this relationship, and we're going to deal with this in a different way. So they embrace that. But I totally agree with what Frank says. But like when I was mentioning the sort of where the areas were opening up with the internationalism in Whitlam's time, we now find that those areas have narrowed down so significantly. I still remember, and I can't remember the exact quote, but it was something along the lines of when Kevin Rudd was asked, well, what's his economic strategy? And he said something along the lines of, well, there's a slither of light between like my approach and Mr. Howard's, or something like that. So there seems to be, like what Frank was saying, this distancing and forgetting, this collective memory aspect, and this shift, particularly with centre-left parties who have become more conservative and much more pragmatic in terms of capturing power.
David, did you want to add to that?
I was just going to add to both those points. I mean, one of the other things about the 70s is the degree to which the Fraser government carries on the agenda. So, for example, Northern Territory land rights implemented by Fraser.
Some of the thing you've done around mining is very interesting, where a lot of the foreign investment stuff is just taken over by Fraser, isn't it?
And also Papua New China, recognition of China, Rhodesia. Yeah.
And even keeping Steve Fitzgerald on and offering him the ambassadorship in Tokyo afterwards.
Yeah, so the degree to which Whitlam influenced both sides of politics is very, very important.
Although that influence didn't last during the Howard period, and in terms of the interaction between Australia and the United Nations, it's unfortunate that in the period of expectation, which was the 1990s, it was Howard's shadow that limited that relationship. In terms of other sort of ideas, this is maybe broadening it out a bit, and looking back to the Timor tragedy, what might have been different if there was a regional human rights institution? we were talking about getting information, that's one thing, but it's actually having a forum to advocate for a different policy that is crucial. And in that period, the United Nations did not provide such a forum. It's partly because of the effect of the Cold War on the development of the United Nations. But there's still a need in the Asia Pacific for some regional human rights forum. And then you can get sort of issues looked at before they become intractable and extremely brutal, which has happened with the Rohingya.
And this goes back to one of Goff's aims to focus on long-term relationships in the region and regional compacts of all of those kinds.
Yeah, I just wanted to go to the bigger picture you were asking about, Leanne, and just say, well, the decision to open missions in China, in DPRK, in the DRV, this is an enormous risk being taken. But what it did do was it opened all those windows that we needed to have open. Now, a lot is said about the reason that these missions were open, but not a lot is said about what happened thereafter. And to some extent, the story of the China mission has become absorbed in the story of the Australia-China economic relationship. Well, that's true, but not quite in the way that the common understanding would have it. Because, of course, one of the very early staffers who went to China was Reg Little. And he started writing these reports about the potential of the Chinese economy and the potential complementarity of the Chinese economy and the Australian economy. Now, this was at a time when China's GDP was about half that of Taiwan. China had almost no international trade and almost no international reserves. It's hard to think of a situation more different than it is today, but some of those early staffers in Steve Fitzgerald's embassy and immediately after could see that potential, so that by the late 70s, when David Nichols became Assistant Trade Commissioner, he was writing reports about all kinds of markets that were opening up in China. So it's not just a case that Whitlam could see from a geostrategic point of view. It was important to open all those windows and see those points of view. But having done that, it then was a really important step in developing this economic complementarity that we've seen emerge since that time.
Yeah. Thank you, very good point. Any other comments or questions? Yes, we have one here.
I'd just like to observe and invite your comments that the last 40 years have been a bit of a tragedy after Goff, with neoliberalism, which has increased inequality and has reduced human rights. And I think we are now visiting the results of that neoliberalism. Lots of economic problems, populism, Brexit, Trumpism. And I think the time will come when we will have to revisit Goff's ideas as a way out of this problem that we are in now.
I'd be happy to respond to that. I agree with some of what you said, certainly growing inequality. I guess I'd also observe that, Australia's not unique, but Australia's relatively unusual amongst developed countries at the moment. Other examples would perhaps be New Zealand and Canada, in having been, I think, largely immune to the kind of populist outbreaks, the anti-immigration outbreaks that we have seen in Europe, in Britain, in the United States to some extent, and to a great extent. And I wonder whether one of the reasons for that is relatively effective leadership, particularly around issues of immigration and race. I'd also, I guess, point to relative economic success. These are all relative points. I'm talking about within a global setting. I came back to Australia after having lived in Britain for a few years in 2011. I found it very frustrating to begin with, the amount of whinging that, was just going on about how dreadful things were in Australia. We'd just come from, you know, the new version of austerity Britain. When I'd go into the office on weekends, you could barely work anymore because you'd always have helicopters overhead because there was 100,000 people marching through London about something or other. And you get back to Australia and you know, we seem so largely unaffected by the GFC. Now I know that, I don't want to sound complacent about any of this stuff, but I do think that we need to keep the Australian situation in some kind of perspective and you know, perhaps we do owe, not just to Whitlam, but actually, you know, a debt to a number of political leaders, not only on the Labor side, both sides of politics over the last generation, a couple of generations, for some of the more positive circumstances in which we find ourselves around this. Because I don't think at the moment we are facing Trumpism in this country. I don't think we're facing anything like Brexit. We may do down the track, but that to me isn't the situation at the moment. I think it's worth asking why that's the case. I don't have any, I've suggested a couple of reasons, but I don't have any full answers to that. But I think it's, to me, an interesting question.
Anyone else like to offer a comment or a question? Yes, please, Damien. Just 1 second, Damien.
Oh, thank you. Just hold it right there. Yeah. Damien Freeman, PM Glynn Institute. I just thought I'd pick up on your point that you wanted to have a conversation about things that were said that were relevant to policy making moving forward. I thought in the David Lee paper on page 6, where he quotes from the election policy speech in 1972, and he says, Australia's real test as far as the rest of the world, and particularly our own region is concerned, is the role we create for our own Aborigines. The role we create for our own Aborigines. And it's interesting, I think, in the period since then, I don't think people, you know, well, let me say, I've been particularly involved with the stuff to do with constitutional recognition. In that context, people would be more inclined to talk, well, let me say, political leaders would be more inclined to talk about the way we recognise our own Aborigines, or perhaps the rights we accord to our own Aborigines, or fail to accord to our own Aborigines. It's really interesting, I think, the way he says this, that it's the role we create for our own Aborigines. I think that's not language that tends to be used at the moment in the political class. And the really significant thing, I think, is if you look at the Uluru Statement, that's actually what it's about. It's about calling for the creation of a role for our own Aborigines. So it's really interesting, I think, that where this has gone is something that he's anticipated here, and which leaders, well, whether you really want to call them leaders, but politicians don't the political class doesn't use that language, and this was sort of really ahead of its time if you think about what's happened with the Uluru Statement. The other side of this observation, though, is that it says here that he explicitly placed his commitment in an international context, which surprises me. Well, let me say, it would sit, from my own experience of trying to do something here, that is sort of the worst thing you could do if you want to try and influence people that we should do something. Trying to place it in an international context is not the way that it seems to, that you seem to sort of build up momentum, in my experience. So it's interesting that he really saw this as part of it, that you had to understand this in an international context rather than in a national context, which, if I were trying to influence people now, I would see it much be emphasising the national rather than the international context.
I mean, as an Australian coming back to Australia after 15 years of being away, that difference is palpable. In that, if you want to win something, you don't talk about the rest of the world or what's happening anywhere else. But to me, that's a terrible sign of how isolated we've become in this country.
Well, that may be a completely fair observation that you make, but but my observation is, if you actually want to try and influence things in Australia, talking about it in the international context for something like this wouldn't strike me as being a good way of doing it. And yet he obviously thought it was a good way of doing it, because this is a speech. This is his election policy speech, and so he clearly thought this was an important thing to be seen like this.
I take your point, and I think you're right. Pragmatically, if you want to get something done, this is not the way you would succeed now. But I think that what we're interested in at the Whitlam Institute is also about trying to generate more coherence between Australia's international positions and our domestic policies. And on many of them, it's almost hypocritical what we say out there to the world and what's happening here. So policy coherence, I think, is something that we should be striving for on a range of issues like this. Is it another comment here from Roderick?
Yes, that policy coherence is very important, but it was not only Whitlam who had that view, and I think it's the correct view, even from our perspective today. It was Fakatsi, led by Faith Bandler and others. On the eve of the 67 referendum, Bandler said, "The eyes of the world are upon us." And the context needs to be understood, and even if the political context seems different in Australia now, one should be optimistic about the potential for change. And perhaps that's one of Whitlam's main legacies. In that area as well as other areas.
Yeah, mine's not a comment there on whether we should be optimistic about change or not, so much as the way you would. And it's just interesting because, and I take your point. It is the era, and it is what people were receptive to at that time. And it's interesting that at that time you would say that and get traction, whereas I think if you wanted to get traction now, you wouldn't say it in quite the same way.
But to go to the quote, there's another phrase in that quote. And the phrase is the greater perspective of history. What Whitlam was actually claiming is there is an objective reality, which is that is how the rest of the world will, at times, in an enduring way, judge Australia.
See, Leon, I think if Whitlam were here now and he was answering your question, he'd say it's quite simple. The issue of climate change is one that moves most Australians. Australia's reputation in the world is completely trashed as long as we are the world's largest exporters of coal. We can't do that any longer, not only because it's bad for the environment and bad for our people, it's bad for the world. And he'd be brave enough to link the national and the international. Now that's an issue that's probably the most important issue for a lot of Australians. Look at the poll data. I didn't hear anybody in the Labor Party putting that position. But they're going to have to, sooner or later. I would guess that'd be the kind of thing that Whitlam would want to see.
I think you're right, climate change. And if I may also offer another anecdote from my Facebook page this morning, a friend in Berlin for a conference, Facebook post, checking into my hotel in Berlin, handing over my passport, expecting the same old comment about sharks and bushfires. But instead the comment was, if we treated refugees the way you do, they'd call us Nazis. It's not the history or it's not how we're going to be perceived in the future about how we're acting now. The perception is out there on big issues like this, and it's about how much that perception affects our place in the world and how we engage in a globalised world, I think. Yes, Roger?
If I could just make another comment, which is partly a quote from Whitlam's speech on international law in 1973, he says, "International law provides the only alternative to tension, chaos and destruction." That's a very profound statement, and it can be interpreted as applying to different contexts, including the one of global warming. If there is no substantial international action based on agreement between governments supported and pressured by transnational citizens' movements, then that's the outcome. Even though he was not envisaging that, because the words are so profound that they can be extended and given a new meaning in a contemporary context.
Just sort of slightly off on a tangent, but just on that general area of, say, constitutional recognition, it's an area that within, say, for example, like genocide studies and things like that within settler societies, one of the things that's often mentioned is, for example, what they call like the demographic issue. One of the reasons, apart from discrimination, racism, imperialism and colonialism, that Indigenous issues have consistently been so marginalised, obviously with all those policies, but has been the demography of settler societies. They have been reduced to a small percentage of the population, and of course that it continues to enable these kinds of debates to be pushed. Oh, we'll have this statement, we won't have that, that won't go to a referendum. Whereas if that demographic element was there, or perhaps it was in the majority, we would have been talking about, you know, the age of Australian decolonisation from imperialism. Within certain settler societies, that's never going to happen. So that's one of the interesting aspects of his discussion around Indigenous rights, is an actual sort of anti-colonial recognition of this fact. We actually have to do this because it's the right thing and because we have to do it. In the past, it's just been ignored, and of course we've seen more marginalisation of that in these debates in the current political environment.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It is, and it's interesting where you think there, like if you compare in Canada with Quebec, because Quebec is so big, Canada has to take that serious. You know, the complaints
have to take it serious.
They have to be taken seriously in a way that, yeah, in the Indigenous populations in these settler countries can be ignored politically, but that's as true now as it was then. Yeah. As I say, I just come back to that word role. I think it's really interesting. It's not just. I mean, what interests me isn't just that he sort of has the moral courage to say that, but he sees that this is about creating a role for them, this isn't just about recognition of them or even about rights for them.
Has to be a role.
It's about creating a role for them, which is, I think, what they're now, that's the language they've now started to use in the Uluru Statement.
Can I just add something? One of the other things that Whitlam's facing is, with respect to Aborigines, a lot of the problem is with the states, because they are implementing the legislation which most often applies to them and which are often discriminatory. So, for example, whether it's drinking in pubs or land rights or whatever. So the weapon that he wants to take advantage of to help him in that battle is through the international covenants that he can then draw on.
It begins the ILO one. Yeah, very interestingly.
Anthony.
My name's Tony Whitlam. My only qualification to be here is I'm Goff's eldest child. I'm certainly not a scholar. I didn't even read history at university. I'm just a jobbing lawyer, and that was my narrow focus of my tertiary studies, which I did owe to Goff Whitlam, but not in the same way as the other people who sit at the table. And I really have no qualifications to participate at all, except this, that my sister who's beside me, Catherine Davey, is on the board here, and I think she had a bit of a heads up that perhaps Dr. Henry's conclusions on this topic had reached a broadly unfavourable view about the conduct of Goff's conduct foreign policy in relation to East Timor. So can I fend against your injunction, Leanne, that we come back to some other topics or more widely, and just for my own part come to East Timor? And can I, in that context, say I couldn't agree more with this statement of Dr. Henry's, which is that Goff would refuse to ever admit, although he wouldn't split the infinitive, philosophical contradictions or concede even a strategic error. And that's true. And it's true, moreover, about not just foreign policy or East Timor, that was everything. So you have to bear that in mind. Nonetheless, I do think, and earlier one of the speakers made reference to the fact that Goff was concerned whether his legacy, so-called, would be defined by the dismissal and indeed by East Timor. And I think in many respects, at least in respect of one generation, East Timor had a very unfavourable effect. I think it's a very young generation, and I think it was not caused so much by the more substantive issues that are being debated today, but by simply the Balibo incident, which was a very populist incident driven by the media in respect of the deaths of the journalists, where for a long time a broad message was put out in the media advancing a hostility towards Indonesia, and particularly an attribution of fault to Goff for the death of those 5 individuals. Oddly enough, it was lifted a bit after the curious coroner's inquiry, which was mandated when Gough was 90 and which he was obliged to testify at, where at least even some of the real partisans of that view took a different view after the event. Whether they thought there was some black helicopter way those people could have been saved or special services, who knows. But it certainly lost a generation, I think, and it lost a generation too about the time of the brutalities at the cemetery in 91, was it, in Dili, when, and again, I hate to say this, it wasn't because I think the large Australian public or the youth people I'm talking about were affected by broadly the situation in East Timor. It was because a few foreign nationals were killed. I think there was a New Zealand citizen who had a Malaysian mother, things like that. Anyway, if I can just, because again, and then to come to Professor Cotton's paper, which has in it, I think I've extracted this statement correctly, Whitlam established the logic and support of the annexation. And in that, against that background of that, you would judge not simply at a failure, but also more broadly, a failure of his policy generally towards Indonesia, which you rightly say he had attributed a fair degree of importance to, and which he made the point, visiting as his second overseas trip. I won't go more broadly into the background of how political issues emerged in Australia over a period of time, and Gough's extensive involvement for them from the time going back to 1952. And of course, to some extent, you're driven by events around the world. So coming to Timor, can I ask this particularly of the Timor experts? And I think I can anticipate Peter's answer anyway, in which I didn't perhaps when I was formulating the thought, is if not long after the New Order government fell in Portugal in 74, and at the dissolution election held in 74, Billy Mackie Snedden had won, which he didn't do too badly in, instead of E.G. Whitlam, do you think that Indonesia would have still invaded and annexed East Timor? That's the first question. And my second question, which is something else which I think is challenged in Gough's approach to the business, is Timor-Leste a viable nation, a viable country? So I don't know whether they make sense, those questions, because it seems to me that there are two things we couldn't have contemplated before Anzac Day 74, that is that the New Order government would disappear in Portugal so quickly, and we couldn't anticipate back that come 1999, B.J. Habibie would become president in the circumstances he did in Indonesia. So given that there was a Suharto regime with all its characteristics, if E.G. Whitlam had never been there as Prime Minister after the 1974 election, do you still think, post the change in Portugal and the events that occurred, Indonesia would have invaded and annexed East Timor?
Difficult for me to answer this in a way because I would never contemplate ever voting Liberal in my life. Nevertheless, Andrew Peacock did have a very different position on East Timor than Whitlam did, as I should say did most of the Labor Party. Tom Uren said that towards the end of it they were very close to a cabinet rebellion on the issue, and had circumstances had not been so extreme, as in the blocking of supply, there probably would have been that. Of course, Fraser and Peacock had very different views on the matter. Fraser made a comment in Parliament who associated Fretland with communists, even though Woolcott knew that they weren't, and the evidence was. On the other hand, Peacock used to stand on podiums with Horta and call him my friend Jose Ramos Horta. The Timorese welcomed the dismissal. They thought it might open a channel for a different approach. My own view is that normal diplomacy... Yeah. Another thing that Fraser, after the invasion, actually made an inquiry of his department about whether it was feasible to refer the matter to the United Nations for a peacekeeping operation. So even Fraser wasn't firmly entrenched. I think if Peacock had been Foreign Minister, I think a situation of normal diplomacy, not overt intervention, but simply saying we support a decolonisation process, we support an act of self-determination, the consideration of referring it to the United Nations, which was advocated by Cotterill and advocated by Miller. It wasn't something that was completely unrealistic. I think probably there would not have been an invasion. I actually think it took a proactive intervention for the faction within the Suharto regime that was the war party to gain the ascendancy. I think the Malik faction would have otherwise won.
Yes, I do think that it is a viable state, and certainly there was a view around that wasn't just Gough Whitlam's at that time that there would be issues with viability, and those debates were played out across the Pacific in that era. You're looking at a state today that has $17 billion in oil and gas money in a sovereign wealth fund in New York, and I could sit here and name a dozen Pacific states that would love to have that sort of. Right. So. Oh, yes, yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, look at Nauru, reduced to hosting our offshore camps. And, you know, places like Solomon Islands don't have anywhere near those resources, and Timor has twice the population of Solomon Islands. Timor today has is regarded as one of the most democratic countries in Southeast Asia by all the measurement agencies in comparative politics. Obviously, it has issues with institution formation, police, and all new countries have these issues of security institutions, and setting up courts is a big problem in Timor. But in terms of freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, those sort of freedoms, Timor's ranked regularly #1 in Southeast Asia, and it's the youngest by a long way. So, I mean, going to issues of viability, certainly those have improved with the recent settlement of the maritime boundary with Australia finally after many years, and that's going to put at least another 8 to 10 billion in those coffers over time. Of course, as a sovereign state, Timor is entitled to make decisions about what it does with those oil and gas issues, and there's the whole issue now of oil and gas processing downstream. I, for one, am pleased that Australia sort of stepped out of that confrontation with Timor. I'm pleased there is a maritime boundary settled according to international law. I do think this is a time where we can move on some of these issues finally. And it's good that we're discussing this today, because you can finally, I think, say as an Australian commentator that the biggest issues between those two nations have now been resolved. And so it is a time where we can probably look back with a bit of perspective on some of the places where it went wrong, but also some of Australia's positive contributions in 1999, for example, and have a balanced assessment of the history. But certainly I would say, as a scholar of the Pacific countries, a lot would be very envious of some of the indicators there in Timor-Leste, and certainly of the income that they have for future development.
Can I just make a comment? Regarding your first question, it's a hypothetical. I mean, I don't know, and I think Peter's probably given the best answer. On the second one, I think it's too soon to say. But you've got to remember, on independence, one of the very first decisions that was taken was that the proceedings of the Parliament and the legal system should be in Portuguese, a language which most people did not understand then and do not understand now. And it was an act that was deliberately taken by the Lusophone elites because they knew that would put them in the driving seat. And we're talking about people from both sides of politics, because they're both Lusophones. And ever since then, we've had a series of political crises because most people feel cut off from the important decisions that are made. Yes, they do have significant reserves by comparison with some other Pacific countries, but both sides have raided the piggy bank in recent times. The reserves are going down quickly. They won't last much longer, and neither will the royalties. So long term, we're talking about a country which has, the last time I looked, I might be a bit out of date, it was the highest birth rate in the world and enormous unemployment. It's simply too soon to say. Some things may happen, but I don't know that it's so hopeful. I sat on the floor, on the ground, in that enormous arena in 2002 for the independence ceremony. And the high point of the independence ceremony is this enormous flagpole, and they pulled up the flagpole, this enormous East Timorese flag. And it was a very still night. Everybody in the amphitheatre was just willing for there to be a breeze so this flag could fly, you see. Not a breath of wind. I thought that was a really bad omen, and some Timorese thought the same.
If a question might have been asked of your father about the Timor tragedy, perhaps the most significant question would have been this: was there a viable UN option? If not, why not? And again, it's a hypothetical, but at the time, I doubt that there was a viable UN option, partly because of reversions in the practices of the Security Council compared to the time that Adam talked about initially as liberal internationalism. Initially, the Security Council meetings were more open and public. By the time of the 70s, they were very secretive and deals were done behind closed doors. And the powers that were most significant were supporting Suharto. Now, it's a question of how he formulated his decision, but was there a UN option at a certain stage? I'm not sure. The broader question is, if not, if there wasn't such an option, what should be done to try to create such an option? And that's where you need some new institution or reforming of existing institutions.
Well, I understand what you say. Yeah.
In a sense, in a parallel with what James said, that the decisions are not separated from the people who they concern.
But I mean, it would at least require at least one great power to be interested in it.
Yes.
And I'm surprised that everybody attributes so much influence to the active encouragement, I think you said, not green light, that Gough allegedly gave. But I would have thought the attitude of the United States would have been much more persuasive in relation to what the Suharto government would do or refrain from doing in relation to East Timor. But that's an amateur's view. I am not a scholar on anything.
But that's right, because of course Suharto went to Washington. He explained what he had in mind, and they said, "Oh, well, we understand, no problem." Yeah. And that's all on record. So we know the Americans encouraged, but we know there were actual positive attempts to use the United Nations system. Yes, the Security Council did condemn the invasion, but the resolution was such that no punishment attached to non-compliance. And everybody knew that that really meant, well, we're speaking stern words, but we don't mean any follow-up. Then we had the mission of Winspear Guicciardi, who was supposed to be sent to investigate the situation on the ground and report back. His mission was systematically frustrated. Nobody seemed to mind. And that was, again, a clear signal. There's no interest in the system in pushing this case. So, yeah, I have a feeling probably by mid-75, any operation in the UN probably wouldn't have had any purchase. Earlier on, there may have been some consequence. I think before the parties fell out in March 75, there might have been some possibility of UN involvement. But after the parties fell out, and certainly after the UD2 coup, I think it was too late.
I've thought about this too in terms of alternatives to what happened, and looked at other examples where the UN has been brought in as an interim administration in places like Kosovo, and wondered why that kind of possibility wasn't considered by Australia anyway at the time. And I wonder if it goes back to your point about power politics and the way the Security Council operates with the veto, that there wasn't enough focus, there wasn't enough pressure between the main stakeholders in the Security Council to make that a viable option.
I dare not make any guess about what Billy McMahon may or may not have done. I think one of the areas, and I think that's all true within this context, I mean, that was one of the great fears of Evatt, that the UN would become or feared, even from the beginning, that it would become a forum of sort of misplaced sort of optimism and again this sort of power politics would take it back over. I mean, this was a big question about the veto and various other things. I think fundamentally one of the main differences, though, of course, is that with the system it is selective. There's no doubt about it, like you mentioned in Kosovo and various other things. It reminds me of a great quote that I heard Professor Noam Chomsky give about terrorism. They asked him, I said, well, what's terrorism? He said, oh, that's easy. When they do it, it's terrorism. When we do it, it's counter-terrorism. This question of selectivity, the Security Council, all of these things, they're all certainly there. I mean, I've been through like the British Embassy documents and things like that. They were very well informed about what was happening. I think the American Moynihan made a comment in his memoirs that he rendered, UN procedures effectively, meaningless, and he was quite proud of that. I think Sir John Ford said, they chaired a committee, they'd take the heat out of the East Timor question. But I think one of the fundamental elements of that comparison, say, between, say, the liberal internationalism and some of the internationalism we see there, is a willingness to actually do it. Not because it's easy, not because it's going to endear us to Washington or London, not because it's not going to create problems, but simply because it's the right way to go. So that's probably the divergence there. Someone has to be actually willing to do that. Whether it could have averted all of the things, I mean, again, that's a debate. Whether it would have certainly have created a new possible environment for dialogue, it certainly would have been a great embarrassment to Washington, London, and it certainly would have been tremendous, embarrassing to Jakarta. And what better advocate for those kind of internationalist principles of self-determination could there have been in Whitlam himself if he'd taken up that thing. I think also the second theme of that is that expectations we've got with them are much higher because of what he achieved, because of what he stood for. And in that sense, if he'd been a run-of-the-mill kind of pragmatic, wheeler and dealer, win some, lose some type of politician, maybe a Kissinger or something, we would look at it and say, well, what would we expect? I think there's an expectation that there could have been more in that regard.
Well, I suppose it depends what else is going on at the time, and there's lots of other demands and what have you. That's the thing.
Yeah. Can I ask about that? I mean, no one's mentioned the level of distraction of this government by 1975. The other aspect is I wonder if too much stress is being placed on internationalism here. I mean, there's also a really powerful tradition of Labor realism. I mean, my recollection is that Evatt wanted to buy up parts of Timor at the end of the war, because they had this idea of this screen of islands that would protect us from the Japanese next time round, or whoever else. Evatt, as has been pointed out, tended to have a somewhat qualified attitude to liberal internationalism once you got to our part of the world. And I just wonder whether there are actually more continuities here. I mean, there is a tradition of Labor realism that works its way through the Whitlam government too. I mean, think of around nuclear issues, the continuing support for the US alliance, for instance, and nuclear deterrence and so on. I mean,
but the battle on White Australia was going on till the early 60s, taking capital W, capital A, capital P out of the platform. And Arthur Coyle was the leader. Fred Daly, who was my sponsor in politics, Fred, after Gough became leader, was nominated immigration spokesman, and Gough had to move him because he was recalcitrant on that, I mean, these were issues that were fought out in the Labor. I think you talk about Evatt. I mean, of course, the glory days of liberal internationalism after the war, I mean, wasn't a bad time for everybody then. And Evatt's reputation, I think, shines much more brightly in our country than it does in the United States and in the United Nations system generally during that period. And of course, in the 50s here, his reputation was destroyed by the Royal Commission and what have you, and his conduct and his deterioration, and Menzies' parliamentary dominance and the split in the Labor Party and his antic behaviour. And really Gough was re-establishing some sort of commitment to liberal internationalism, which was much resented. I mean, you go back, Professor Cotton's read the books. He's read some very strange books, that abiding interest and stuff like that. But I mean, Gough was interested in decolonisation from the get-go and pursued everybody about it, including Hasluck, who said he was defending liberty in Indochina. Well, the French were, he said. Hasluck was defending them. I mean, weird. Those were battles to be won, and you can imagine how much interest there was in that in the caucus, like zilch. By the time of 1969, when you're getting some really decent people like Ralph Jacobi coming in, they're a bit more interested. But those old hardheads, they weren't interested in this stuff, I can tell you. And it was putting it back on the agenda. Anyhow, there we are. But I'm not a scholar, so I'm not.
I think you've represented yourself very well. And thank you, everybody. We're a bit over time now, but what a fascinating conversation. I could sit here and have it well into the night with a bottle of wine, but we won't do that. But we might stay in touch with each of you if you're interested to keep the conversation going. Thank you to Adam. Thank you to all our panellists for those wonderful contributions to his work as well. And thank you to all of you for listening so intently and for the great comments and questions you had. We're really glad to host you. So have a good afternoon and thanks a lot.